I love questions. I've learned over time that learning to ask great questions at the right time can give you insights and help you see and discover things that everyone else misses. And this is valuable when you're going about that literal or metaphorical treasure hunting, when you're engaging in problem solving, when you're going about serious truth seeking in your life, in your work, in various aspects of your life. So let's talk about 5 questions that I'd like to encourage you to think about using more regularly when you're going about that literal and metaphorical treasure hunting in your life, and see where they might take you. I think you'll find them valuable. The more you ask them, the more you practice asking them and seeking multiple answers to each question, the more valuable they become. But before I get into those 5 questions, I want to tell a story about myself. I started as a middle school teacher years and years ago, and I had a lot of challenges in my classroom the first year that I started teaching. The students came in and they had an immense amount of energy, and some were not particularly well behaved in the classroom, and they were challenging me. And I remember one time that there was a student that sat in the back row, and he managed to crawl under the desks of every other student from his back seat all the way to the front and grab something off of my desk and crawl back without me even noticing him. And there were a lot of other situations that occurred in those years, and I was feeling distraught and thinking like, I don't think I'm cut out for teaching. I'm probably going to make this first year my last year of teaching. Well, I ended up teaching for 12 years, and then I went on to other things with consulting and working in a university and different kinds of things as well later on. But here's what kept me teaching and turned what was a disaster into a delight in my classroom. And then I'm going to tie that into these 5 lessons that we can use, the 5 questions we can use. But I was feeling so overwhelmed that the principal of the school, I went into him and I just confessed, my class is a disaster. It's not going well. I don't know if I can do this. And he began to just ask me some questions. Asked me about how I prepared my lesson, how I went about organizing my class, how I started my class, how I ended my class. And he just asked question after question after question. And he began to piece together a story and an explanation for why I was having problems. And so he was able to make some suggestions to me. And interestingly enough, the suggestion that he made was for me to learn to ask more and better questions. He introduced me to this sort of hierarchy of question asking that starts with basic factual questions and moving all the way to questions that invite students to have to use creativity and deep analysis and synthesis of knowledge in order to answer them. And noticed that in my classes, I was often at these lower level of thinking, and I was asking simple factual questions that were not engaging or inviting the students into the deeper level of learning that would cause them to be more engaged in the learning and less engaged than the unruly behavior. And he taught me how to learn to design and prepare questions that I could ask to shape my lesson. And when I did that, it was truly about as close to a miraculous turnaround in my class that I'd ever imagined. Things were not perfect. I still had to deal with classroom management and behavioral issues and the like. And yet, my class was fun and engaging and interesting, and students were learning and asking their own questions, and I was making more eye contact with the students and they with me, and I could see them engaged and learning, and it was a transformational experience, and it led me to thoroughly enjoying teaching middle and high school for almost a dozen years before I went to teaching on the university level and doing other things. So questions matter, and learning to ask questions can be transformative in our problem solving and our truth seeking and our metaphorical and our literal treasure hunting. And so I'm going to take you through 5 questions I've jotted down that I think are really great, especially with truth seeking and treasure hunting and problem solving. The first question is to ask this: what am I assuming? So most people don't challenge their own mental shortcuts. The fact that there are cognitive biases, and see all my other videos on cognitive biases. I have quite a few, and there will be more added over time, most likely. But ask the question, what am I missing right now? What is it that I'm assuming that's causing me to miss some things? So what are my assumptions? And just jot down, what am I assuming to be true? And write what I assume to be true. And then after you look at the things you wrote down, challenge them a little bit. Challenge your assumptions and see if it leads you somewhere interesting. The second one is to ask this question, what if I flip things around? So change the angle or the perspective of how I'm looking at this or talking about this. If I'm assuming, and so I force myself to assume something opposite than what maybe I think is true at first, but as a sort of thought experiment. So you flip your thinking, and that will cause you to look at the topic from a new angle or a new perspective, and that will allow you to see things that you missed. Now, maybe that's not maybe you need to go back to the original way of thinking eventually, but simply shifting your thinking in this way and flipping your thinking will allow you to see things very, very differently. And I even did this when I was in school and I was teaching, and I spent years teaching graduate students about how to design engaging and high impact learning experiences. And oftentimes I would have a teacher say, for example, how do I address classroom behavior problems in my classroom, like what I described before? And maybe what if you flipped the question and said, how do I take advantage of classroom behavior problems to enhance and engage learning? Or maybe that you start by saying, these young people are so energetic, I don't know what to do with them. How do I calm them down? What if you ask the question, how do I get them more excited? That's the idea of flipping it, right? So you can do that. I was just giving these classroom examples because I guess I had primed my mind to think about classroom because of the story I shared before, but this applies to any kind of situation, including those literal metaphorical treasure hunts that we go on. The third one is what doesn't make sense? What is not adding up? So force yourself to kind of look at the situation and say, that's not right. That's out of place. Something seems to be missing here. And assume almost that something is missing when you ask this question. What is not adding up? And it's going to force you to look for nuances and details and things that others miss. And this is very big in the workplace and the like, when there are lots of workplaces that create these habits and these patterns and these rituals and these traditions that are actually undermining their success, and they don't realize it because they've just been so caught up in it. And coming and asking the question, what's not adding up? What's not making sense? What's not actually achieving the goal? We're talking about working very, very hard, but is the hard work actually paying off? And why is it not? What's not adding up? So asking that question as we're going about, again, our literal and metaphorical treasure hunts can be very powerful. The fourth question is, this is one that you probably haven't heard as much, is what feels familiar, but it might actually be misleading? What looks kind of familiar and similar, but it could have some other layers of meaning to it? Now, this is especially true in real treasure hunts because this is how they work, is that there are clues that are hidden in plain sight oftentimes, but you have to look at the word in a new way. Like there might be the word brown in a sentence, but the B is capitalized, so it's not talking about the color, it's talking about a proper noun, proper name. Maybe it's a place, maybe it's a person, maybe it's something else. So you're noticing those kinds of nuances, but what feels familiar but might be misleading, and looking around for those things, and that's where you discover clues. Now, this is not just true in literal treasure hunts. This is true in all sorts of problem solving in our life. What feels familiar, but it might actually be misleading. And then the fifth question that I'll offer for you today, and there are lots of others that we could get to and ask, is are there any sort of subtle or hidden patterns or structures? Now, we want to be careful because we can force patterns on things that don't exist. Like if you look up in the clouds, if you look long enough, you'll see animals and all sorts of shapes that are actually not really there. It's your mind's eye kind of creating them and creating patterns where they don't exist. And our minds are designed to do that because we are meaning seekers. We thrive on finding meaning and purpose and order. And so we create order if it doesn't exist. But when you're engaging in problem solving and you're engaging in literal and metaphorical treasure hunting, there are patterns. There are patterns that are not explicit. And so simply asking the question, what are the patterns or structures? and then priming yourself to think and look. Now, asking these questions are not single, like 1 minute, 2 minute exercises. You can linger on these questions for an extended period of time. And the more you do, and the more you return to them, the more they deliver some really neat results. I hope you find this useful. I look forward to your comments.